Longevity, and I've been part of longevity now for 17 years. 17 years. Do you want to hear my story real quick? No, I'm not going to tell you my story about longevity. How I met Dr. Wallach, it's a really cool story. It's a funny story, but we don't have time to do that. I'm not going to do that right now. But one of the neatest things about longevity and about Doc is our dedication to making everybody better. If you do, I go to these things called Super Saturdays. Anybody ever been to a Super Saturday? Do you do Super Saturdays? Pete, do some Super Saturdays. Super Saturdays are when, at least in Colorado where I'm from, are when you get better, not just at being in the business, you get better at being alive. You learn skills for being alive, for navigating this thing called life more effectively. And that really, you know, we focus on nutrition, but that's what it's about. It's about navigating through our world much more effectively. If you're sick, there's no way you can fully maximize your potential if you're sick. So the bottom line, the baseline is get the mighty 90, no matter what. I was talking to some gals in the front here earlier. You know, there's specific kinds of illnesses that they wanted to deal with. Get on the mighty 90. When we do our trainings, when we do our Super Saturdays, we talk about the basics of nutrition and we talk about the basics of life. And one of the neatest things about Dr. Wallach is his books, and in my humble opinion, we don't talk about his books anywhere near enough. And he's got countless, 30, 20, how many books have you written?
14 books for the general public and another 14 books for science.
So 28 books, okay? And there's 14 for the general public are really, really accessible. They're easy to understand. See how did you get how commonsensical everything was? You know, it's like it's hidden in plain sight. It's so obvious. So Doc Wallach's books are really, really easy to understand. And his new book, which is called EpiGenetics, is like a walk through. One of the things about Dr. Wallach is he's a polymath. And Dr. Wallach is one of the few people I know that would ever even say the word polymath, because he is a polymath. A polymath is somebody who has an understanding of various subject matters and weaves them together and forms his own picture. Dr. Wallach understands sociology, Dr. Wallach understands history, Dr. Wallach understands anthropology, Dr. Wallach understands biology, Dr. Wallach understands nutrition, Dr. Wallach understands pathology, he understands chemistry, he understands nutrition, and he weaves it all together in this way that is so fascinating. And he does it in all his books, and it's what I've really loved about his books for many years. But this one is epic. It's epic. It's about and it's appropriately has the word epic in it. Epic means transcendent. And epigenetics is the science of what is transcendent to genetics, what is above genetics, what controls genetics. Everybody thinks that it's about genetics. We always hear that. That's what we hear. It's about genetics. It's in your genes. But remember, it's so obvious when you think about it. If your heart cells need nutrition, and your brain cells need nutrition, and your stomach cells, and your intestinal cells, and your bone cells, and all the other 200 plus cells in your body need nutrition, don't you think your genes need nutrition too? Don't you think that one of the key components of a cell would need nutrition? Of course, if the mother is nutritionally deficient. Of course, if the mother is gluten intolerant. Of course, if the mother's got malabsorption syndromes of some kind, you're going to see something that's going to look like genetics, but it's not the genetics. And it's the same with cholesterol, by the way. It's not the cholesterol. The cholesterol is just a sign of a biochemical breakdown that can only be caused by one thing at the bottom from a physical perspective at the most fundamental level, and that is a lack of nutrients or a lack of absorption. So what we're going to do for the next 15, 20 minutes, half hour, as long as you guys want, as long as Doc is willing to share with us, we're going to go over this book a little bit because I find it very, very fascinating. I've got some questions I want to ask, and then maybe you'll get a sense of what I mean when I say that Doc is truly, 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 by any standard, a polymath, a genius, and it's an honor to be doing this. Thank you so much. Thank you, Doc. Okay, so.
Microphone. Test.
All right.
Microphone.
I'm going to cut right to the chase. I'm going to cut right to the chase.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I'm on. I'm going to cut right to the chase.
Test.
Why did you write this book, first of all, EpiGenetics, most importantly?
Well, basically, that book was written because Emory University and Yerkes Primate Center fired me for discovering that cystic fibrosis, thought to be a genetically transmitted disease, is simply a nutritional deficiency during pregnancy. It is reversible because it's a biochemical problem, not a physical thing that you have to do surgery after the baby's born. And they fired Jerry Lewis. The Jerry Lewis story is in there. They fired Jerry Lewis for him taking the data to the Massachusetts Foundation to help kids. How can you fire Jerry Lewis? That story had to be told. And then, of course, when I was in Missoula, Montana, about 3 years ago now, a physician called up on the radio, and he thought he was on the telephone. He said, "Put Wallach on the phone with me." And he thought he was being put on the phone with me. He said, "Well, I'm Dr. So-and-so. I'm from the such and such surgical group here in Missoula. If you come to our emergency room unconscious, you won't leave alive." Now, this went out over the radio, live radio, with tens of thousands of people, maybe millions of people listening. And you could hear the voice in the background. "Doc," not me, him. "Doc, you're on the radio live."
Great.
Click.
By the way, what's the title of that? You remember the title of the chapter?
Yes, it's actually it's the one
Or the
on
subject matter. You had 3 or 4 different ones,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, this is witchcraft.
Witch doctors.
Yes, witch doctor. Yes,
you
this
call
was this was Missoula witchcraft or witch hunt.
Right, and
Missoula
there's-
witch hunt.
Oh, the witch hunts, right.
Yeah.
And there was a couple other really interesting witch hunts. There was a case where you were called to testify.
Yes, Bell Howard.
Yeah, tell the story of Bell Howard.
Well, Bell Howard was an herbalist in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And Bell Howard, 2 years before this gentleman died in the VA hospital, had spent 2 months giving him some herbs because he had some pain, and she helped him with some herbs to get rid of his pain or manage his pain. And 2 years later, he dies in the VA hospital, and the VA doctors there saw an opportunity to get rid of the herbalists in their state and also take the blame away from themselves. And they lodged 23 felony charges against her, this herbalist, and said this veteran died of a treatable cancer because she had treated him for 2 months, 2 years earlier. Right. So the attorney, William Moore, contacted me and said, "I need you to be the pathologist on this case," because he'd read a lot of my stuff. And make a long story short, I agreed to do it, went there, and very quickly recognized that they had given this guy 7 different drugs that should not be given with each other, called polypharmacy. And these drugs mixed together was a deadly mix. Only one thing had happened was death. So what I did was I went through the PDR, the physician's desk reference, highlighted those drugs, put markers like you did here, and the attorney, Bill Moore, had the state medical examiner who'd done the autopsy on this guy read the drug, which it was already in the terminal entry forms when the guy went to the hospital to die. And he read the name of the drug, and then I highlighted the warnings. And by the time he got to the 3rd one out of the 7, he knew what was happening. And he stands up and he slams the book down on the judge's bench. Wrong thing to do. So the judge is beating the bench with his gavel. He says, "Sir, you'll sit down and answer Mr. Moore's question." This guy said, "I'm not going to answer it." He said, "So you're going to jail for contempt of court if you don't read them." This is all going on in this federal courtroom. And so he starts crying. He wept through the rest of the trial because he had to read the rest of the stuff. And of course, the jury found Bell Howard innocent of all 23 felony charges.
Not a foregone conclusion.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
So they had killed the guy with polypharmacy.
Which I know well about,
Yes.
polypharmacy. The average American is on 12 prescriptions a year, and many of you out here are not on prescriptions. That means somebody's on 24 and 36 and 48, and I know for a fact they are because as a pharmacist, I used to be the guy behind the counter when the plastic bag that filled with all the various bottles was dumped on the counter, and sometimes there was literally 20 to 25 different bottles in a plastic bag. How can we ever how can that possibly compute to some medical professional to dispense to one person polypharmacy like this, the way these things interact? All right. So one of the neat things about the book is how you learn about history as you read through the book, and it's all framed within health, but there's some really interesting historical facts. For example, one of my favorite stories is about the cave paintings. Now, the with the cave paintings, they used to, they noticed that they were chopping their fingers off.
Yes.
Will you talk about the truncated digits and the cave paintings?
Well, what these artists would do, they would cut off the same fingers, and they would punch holes in the mud in the walls there, which sort of petrified, if you will. They could actually pour plaster of Paris in there and get their fingerprints and the fact that they had literally cut their fingers off as a marker. This was their signature of these paintings on the walls. But also it meant that they all belonged to the same group or the same tribe or this, whatever. And it's amazing the things that they would do. They would tattoo themselves. Some of these people, the Iceman, from the same time.
That's right.
Otzi.
I don't think you did.
Yeah.
Oh, you mentioned
Oh,
Otzi. Yeah, you mentioned
the
Otzi.
Iceman.
Do you guys know about that? You ever hear about the Iceman? The Iceman is an interesting story. He's the oldest man. I think he was the guy that, he was the unfortunate gentleman who had the great misfortune of walking in the woods like right before the Ice Age hit.
Yeah.
And the Ice Age hit on this
ice.
guy, and it hit him really quickly, and he freeze-dried basically, and he's still intact as the Iceman. They found a little pouch and they found the stuff inside the pouch.
His arrows and his quiver.
His arrows and his quivers.
But also, he had tattoos all over him, and including a crucifix. He actually had, and this is thousands of years before Christ.
Serious?
He had a cross, tattooed on him. Yeah. And the interesting thing about him was that he was a meat eater, and he had still food in his stomach. They had all this stuff about this guy.
You could tell what he ate.
Yeah, tell what he ate. And he did have arteriosclerosis. He did have arthritis. He had some fractured ribs. He fell off the cliff or run over by a buffalo or something.
Yeah.
But this gives you information over time, over thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. It's like a window into
Yes.
12,000 years ago. Or,
Yes.
or how long was it? 12, 13,000 years ago? Something like that?
I think it was longer than that. It
Yeah?
was like 18,000 years ago.
Imagine. That's amazing. That's amazing. All right, so let's talk about the Chaldeans. I love this idea of how astrology got involved with medicine. And medicine, we got this idea that medicine is this real scientific art, but it wasn't always all that scientific, or perhaps they considered it science back in the day. But it had a lot. There was a lot of superstition, and there was a lot of ritual, and there was a lot of non-scientific understandings about how the body worked. And one of the non-scientific ways that people looked at the body and at health and healing involved astrology. The Chaldeans, etc.
Yes, well, the Chaldeans, they were a group of people, of course, that were really astronomers. And they loved tracking planets and comets and things like this. They were very, very good at it. And they were amongst the first ones to notice that the planets went around the sun. They were very, very scientific, very mathematically orientated. They were the ones that actually began to make math into a science. And they were very, very religious people. And I think probably they were the ones that brought health into the science. They were sort of the interface.
Yeah, a cross between the two, yeah. But they still believed in that there was some kind of connection between how the stars worked and how the body worked, and diseases were based on the stars.
Exactly. Well, they still believed that if you burned enough goats and if that wasn't strong enough medicine, you had to burn your neighbor to make the little god sitting on Mars happy.
Even Plato, even as we got further into the more philosophical age, even Plato had some of these kinds of understandings, and Hippocrates and Galen, they believed in the humors, etc. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, the humors, of course, were phlegm and black bile and yellow bile and blood and so forth, and lymph. And they believed that disease was caused by an imbalance of these things. And their simple view of it was that if they would take blood from you, they would do bloodletting to try and balance out these humors. And that was their treatment. Here you are, you're weak, you're anemic, you're falling apart, you have an infection, and they're taking a couple of pints of blood from you to try and balance out the humors. And so they killed as many patients with their treatments as they did, and they felt that they had done so much egregious stuff, made the gods unhappy, and the gods took their life. But that was what they believed in those days.
Well, it wasn't until a guy came around, and I love saying this guy's name. May I say it? Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. Do you guys know who that is? Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim.
And so everybody called him by his nickname, Paracelsus.
Paracelsus. Have you guys heard of Paracelsus? Now you know Paracelsus was really Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim.
That's correct.
But he was the first guy who really started to, he took some of these ancient kind of Greek philosophy sort of thinking, Galen and Hippocrates and some of the doctors of the day who believed in the biles, et cetera. And he started to, this is when we start to understand that we may be able to manipulate the body using chemistry. Tell us a little bit about Paracelsus.
Yeah, so Paracelsus was actually hired by governments to work with the miners and stuff because he was interested in metals. Right. And how metals would be used for treatments. And this is at the same time that from India they were grinding up jewels, and jewels are made out of trace minerals. And they would use jewels, grind up jewels, and use the trace minerals from ground up jewels to treat people. And it worked because they're
Mummy does too. Mummy Dust was around this time too.
About the same time. And so they were beginning to realize that there were certain minerals that would cure certain diseases. And Paracelsus, one of his greatest stories was he was in a town, and there was a famous person in town who had gangrene of the leg, and all the physicians said, well, the only thing we can do is cut his leg off to save him because he had gangrene of the leg. Well, Paracelsus saved his leg and saved the guy by giving him minerals, right?
Is this documented?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Very well documented.
That's a great story.
And that story is in there. And they chased him out of town because all their patients went to him. And then when he went to the next town, he started advertising in the newspapers, and he gave free speeches all over the place to show how he could treat and cure people that the doctors couldn't, still believing in little gods up on the planets. And as a result, he got all their patients, and they chased him out of town again. The doctors chased him out of town.
This is about the same time as probably one of your heroes, I imagine, giving you're the modern-day version of this guy. This is around the time that Galileo came around. And Galileo had the nerve to question ordinary authority, much the same way that Paracelsus and some of the other thinkers, like yourself, have questioned the standard conventional wisdom. And they paid the price. Tell the story a little bit about Galileo. Galileo, as it turns out, was friends with the Pope, and he got saved.
And we told that story during my lecture.
Oh, you did tell that story about the Pope?
Yeah, and you may not have been in here, but yeah, they were kids growing up together who was a cardinal.
Oh, you told the story of the Pope?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And when he became the Pope, the Inquisition Committee had condemned Galileo to death for going against the church dogma, which said that the sun went around the earth. And he said, no, all the planets go around the sun. And he documented that using the Chaldean math and so forth. That's how they all kind of came together there.
He had like a benefactor. The Pope was one of his benefactors, essentially.
Yes, and the Pope was able to commute his sentence, not completely,
right,
because the Inquisition Committee was so powerful,
right,
the Pope couldn't do that. But he did get it commuted from death, being burned at the stake, to house arrest for the rest of his life. And
there's around the same time period, there's an interesting connection between the Inquisition and and potatoes. And it turns out that right around the same time, a guy had to escape from the Inquisition, I believe, and he came over here. He didn't necessarily do it to escape from the Inquisition, but that was one of the things that happened. His name was Christopher Columbus, and he came over here and he settled the New World. He began the settlements in the New World, and one of the things that happened is they started to transmit foods and spices, and there was a merging of the two worlds. He came out, and there's this neat word that I'd never heard before called the homogenocene. The homogenocene, right?
Yes.
I had first heard that in your book. Tell us a little bit about the homogenocene.
To the beginning of the Earth, when there was just one big continent. It broke into two pieces over time, over long periods of time, of course. And what happened was there were certain animals went with one piece, and certain animals and peoples went to the other piece, and they developed separately. And so you have kangaroos in Australia, and you have elephants in Africa, and you had white-tailed deer in America, and so on. Polar bears in Alaska.
Pangea.
Yeah, Pangea. Well, Pangea was the original complete one continent. And when Columbus went from Europe to the western place, he was looking for India, kind of going that direction. And he unknowingly brought with him worms, earthworms from Europe, and parasites of all kinds, birds and rats and bacteria and things that did not exist in the Western Hemisphere. He brought them with him in his boats. and it turned them loose on the Western Hemisphere. And of course, then he took animals and things from, and plants from the Western Hemisphere back to Europe, and one of which was the potato, and saved so many people because there was a famine going on in Europe. And the one thing that saved people was potatoes were easy to grow and produce a lot of calories. And so it was kind of this two-way exchange.
Right, that's the homogeneous, as you
That's
say.
right.
I hadn't heard that term
Homogeneous.
before. So potatoes and earthworms, I was struck by that. Those are two very humble yet very fundamental elements of our modern world, are earthworms and potatoes,
We would
right?
not have earthworms here without Columbus.
And earthworms were very important for the cultivation of the soil, exactly. So I don't know if you guys know this, I know you didn't mention this in your book. Before the eagle was a national bird, what was the national bird supposed to be?
Turkey.
The turkey, right? Did you ever see that?
Benjamin Franklin.
He wanted the turkey, right? Did you know that would have been our national bird, the turkey? Did you guys know that? Turkeys were pretty bad animals. I mean, they're nasty animals. They were, back in the day, they weren't like the kind we have today. Everything's been domesticated. We've been domesticated. You know, pussycats weren't always pussycats. They were big, bad lions, and turkeys weren't always gobble, gobble Thanksgiving Day drumsticks. They were big, bad animals. But I always thought, after reading this, I'm thinking, well, the earthworm should be our national totem. The earthworm is way more important to us as a country, as a source of our wealth and abundance than a turkey or an eagle. Talk a little bit about the importance of earthworms and how earthworms were instrumental in the development of this country.
Well, the thing that earthworms do is to bring minerals to the surface of the soil, from way down deep in the soil up to the surface, because they eat by eating soil, and it all comes out the back end. And if you pay attention and you go through the yard before you mow it and walk through it, you see these little cones sticking up into maybe a half-inch in between the blades of grass. This is where the worms have come up for some air or whatever, but it allows water to go down in the soil. It follows their tracks, and they bring up minerals deep down up to the surface where plants can get them. And they take bits of leaves and things down deep for their own selves, and the bacteria and things that grow in the soil eat that, and it just makes
like living plows.
Oh yes,
they're like
exactly,
living plows.
Exactly.
That's amazing. You know, that's also, speaking of the humble roots of the very things that are the most important things of our modern lives. Not only are earthworms incredibly important, but so are bacteria. Talk a little bit about bacteria and how bacteria are involved in the whole process.
Well, when you fertilize your garden, most people don't realize this, you're feeding the bacteria in the soil. You really don't feed the plants directly. Whether you're giving cow manure, chicken manure, if you're giving Miracle Grow, or anything you're putting in the soil, you're actually feeding the bacteria. And the bacteria break down the rocks into dust, into minerals. And the bacteria will also, it's called fixed nitrogen. They take nitrogen out of the air and put the nitrogen in the soil, which is a growth-driving substance for plants. And so between the bacteria, the worms, these small, seemingly insignificant creatures are responsible for our livelihood.
Isn't that interesting? There's another very, interesting, there's small creatures that are very important for the development of bigger creatures and bigger creatures and bigger creatures than us. But there's even something more humble, if you will, than a tiny little creature that really has an impact on our food chain and on how we live our lives, and that is bird poop. We talk a little bit. You have a really interesting story about
guano.
Yeah. You have an interesting story about how the food chain depends on really what is just basically bird poop or bird urine. It's a combination thereof, and you might want to talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah, again, this goes back to Europe was failing terribly. They had famines because the soil was played out. And when they switched from wood to coal, and they went from coal to electricity, there was no more wood ashes going into the soil, so the soil became played. As they harvested crops, all the minerals are going away. And they knew that there was a fertility problem. There's actually a German scientist, the same guy as the Humboldt. They named the Humboldt currents after him. And he took all this guano back to Germany, boatloads of it from these islands, these guano islands off the coast of South America. And he had a chemist analyze it. It was full of nitrogen. He knew that it could be used for fertilizer. And so he started bringing back boatloads of the stuff.
I want to talk about the food chain, the boobies and the guano.
Yeah, boobies, we're talking about birds, not boobies.
No, yes, boobies, the bird. There are these specific boobies. Yeah, that's right. I guess that is a little confusing. No, the bird boobies. There's these specific boobies that feed off the guano. They feed off the guano, and then
No. They feed off the little fish.
No, that's right. That's right. You get the plankton and the zooplankton, and ultimately you get the boobies. Talk about that whole food chain, how that depends on that whole chain and how it's linked to the guano.
Okay, well, because this area where these islands were off the west coast of South America, these birds, the boobies, the cormorants, and the pelicans were the three groups of birds. They produce an enormous amount of urine and poop together in one little, the white part of the bird poop,
which is very good stuff.
Is the urine.
It's nutritionally dense. It's got lots of nitrogen.
That's right, nitrogen. And they would follow these huge schools of fish, which was named after Humboldt because he discovered those currents and everything. So they were always there in the spring and the summertime and the fall getting these fish, and they would perch on these islands, and there was no rain. They were very arid islands, and so each booby would produce, maybe a ton of this stuff a year per bird. And there was actually a lady whose name escapes me right now, but she actually wrote a book on bird poop and how.
Vertebrate excretion.
Exactly.
Something about. I looked it up. I was going to try to buy it today.
Yeah,
actually,
and she actually calculated how much fertilizer.
25 pounds or something.
Yeah,
you said.
per bird per year, just of urine. And they took boatloads of this back to Europe. It was a huge economic boon to Europe, both as a product, bringing it into Europe, because the guys who brought it back made a lot of money, but also it saved Europe from famine that would have wiped out everybody. So between the potatoes and the guano, it saved Europe.
Isn't that funny?
Simple stuff.
Exactly. It's such simple stuff.